Chakrasamvara, the Wheel of Bliss, is a central figure for all of Tantric Buddhist art. We saw earlier in the other room a historical figure of Padmasambhava, the 8th century Tantric master who came to Tibet. We saw him in union with the Tibetan princess, Yeshit Sogyal. We see the embodiment of a path to realization that does not renounce worldly pleasure, worldly passion, but actually brings it into the path. And we see here almost a divinization of that human act of procreation turned into a creative act of engendering the Buddha within ourselves. So in this literal sense here we see an act of sexuality that's not a worldly passion, it's literally a way of bringing out and bringing to birth our own Buddha nature. So we give birth to ourselves in this tantric kind of ideology that's actually represented symbolically in this image. So Buddha nature was identified in the later Mahayana form of Buddhism as our own intrinsic actual being, beyond our personal sense of identity, beyond the self, which Buddhism recognized to be a process and not anything that was ever in any way self-existent. So we see that depicted in this image particularly as this blue head of a Buddha emerging out from the top of the head of the male figure here. And this is basically the Buddha nature, the awakened nature of wisdom and compassion emerging from within our physical form, out of the head as it were. We see also on either side of that, we see a crescent moon on the one hand and a skull on the other. We see this kind of cosmological symbolism. We also see this image that we're always reminded of in Tantric Buddhism, that even in the midst of this kind of rapture and bliss, there's always a skull to remind us of the impermanence of it. But this is not in some kind of negative way to reflect on everything being impermanent and therefore not, worthy of our attention, but it's actually showing that there's this creative cycle of destruction and creativity that's inherent to existence in every form. We look at early Buddhism and we see that the Buddha recognizes this desire, this thirst for existence, that's the thing that keeps us in this wheel of existence from which we never escape. Because as long as we desire something, we are in a state of dissatisfaction, of unfulfillment, because we never actually can attain everything that we desire. So what in Tantric Buddhism it's done is it takes desire as the path, which would seem to be a contradiction. But in fact, what it's doing is taking bliss as the path, what was called ananda. Because bliss is inherently non-dualistic, it's not based on subject and object. When we're in a state of bliss, there's nothing we want. We're already in a state of absolute fulfillment. So the idea was that if we can work with that quality within us, which is our own awakened nature, which is inherently blissful, when we look inward and we find that we actually don't need anything externally in order to engender that state of luminosity, of clarity and bliss that's actually inherent within our own intrinsic Buddha nature. This is an image that tries to bring us to that recognition. So although we're seeing it as a figure in sexual union, it's actually about a state of psychic integration within our own being, bringing together these polarized forces to bring about a state of ecstatic self-transcendence and what is very critical to all of Tantric Buddhism, bliss in union with emptiness. Emptiness being the openness, the lucid expanse of reality and the bliss of that. So it's not something that's dependent on anything external, but actually intrinsic to our own deepest nature. So when we think of this as a support for a kind of psychological transformation, what we're doing is we're actually recognizing this is a divine form which is not separate from us, it's actually our own nature made manifest, and therefore the egoic nature, the kind of personal self, the socialized self, the conditioned self is being trampled beneath the feet of this divine form, the Wheel of Bliss. So we see this figure on the right is almost like melting. We see a head pressed down. So in other words, this is the crushing of the egoic self. The figure on the other side is representing that same kind of prostration of the ego on another level, just sort of flayed out, and then out of that arises this ecstatic dimension of experience once the ego has been sort of put in its place by being pushed down literally into the ground. They were in fact interactive forms of iconography. So they weren't, as we might think of it in the Western tradition, an icon, something that you would actually use to support a kind of belief system, a faith, to reinforce faith. They were actually to reinforce faith in ourselves. They were to recognize this Buddha nature, the Buddha within us, through which the art was, in a sense, a mirror of. And so in that sense, it's like recognizing yourself. It's as if you were looking into a mirror, but seeing beyond the flesh and the bloods and the bone into this emergent divinity in which Tantra recognized that we all have and we all share. This wisdom and compassion, it is our deepest nature. One of the wonderful things about Tantra is never one-sided. Even if we don't have any background in Buddhist philosophy or Tantra, we can still see this wonderful coming together of something ecstatic, rapture, but something terrifying about it at the same time. We see loving figures embraced by skulls. And so there's a kind of almost a cognitive dyslexia that happens in that. But that's the power of the object. And in a certain sense, this is about Tantra. So it's no longer just about rapture, it's just as much about terror. It's about trying to awaken out of our habitual slumbering sensibilities that actually keep us in this very limited sense of what life is all about. And in that sense, it's a wonderful transition into the next stage of the exhibition, which is about encountering and embracing the shadows, embracing the darkness, so as to integrate those aspects of existence that we normally suppress, whether that's love and passion, or whether that's actually the fear and terror of death and annihilation. Carl Jung, the psychologist, once said something very beautiful, which is that enlightenment does not consist of imagining figures of light, but in making the darkness conscious.